Hello, it seems that every time I hold a microphone, I lose the ability to speak because this is like my third time recording this, but my project is on relationships, sexuality, compulsory heterosexuality. To start off, I want to ask if you've heard this song. The song is called Good Luck Babe, and it just crossed 1 billion streams on Spotify. It's Chapa Rowan's most popular song, and she's a new and up and coming queer artist. And if you actually pay attention to the lyrics, which, let's be honest, many don't, you'd find an interesting story and connection to important texts in gender studies. So, the song is from the perspective of a lesbian singing to her former female lover who she predicts will marry into a straight relationship. This is made most explicit in the song's bridge, which I cannot play, but I can put up the lyrics so you can read, so pause if you want to. But the song is essentially about a comp-het relationship, which is a term you may have heard before. It's often used in queer spaces, particularly lesbian ones, and in casual usages, it essentially refers to the pressure to act straight or to be straight, even if you aren't. So the term comp-het is actually an abbreviation. Put a pin in that, as we'll circle back to what the actual word means later. But Good Luck Babe has an interesting connection to comp-het, but also broader aspects of sexuality, representation, and gender studies in general. So, to start off the video, I want to ask, what is gender studies? Part 1, Gender Studies. So, if you know nothing about gender studies, consider this your rudimentary quick look at the fundamentals. So, the short and sweet, gender studies, in addition to women's and sexuality studies, is the study of how social, institutional, and cultural factors impact marginalized people, particularly those who aren't men. They argue that analyzing the social production and reinforcement of gender is integral to analyzing oppression for all. So I just mentioned producing gender, and at the core of gender studies is the theory of gender, because gender on a wider scale refers to the categorization of certain social attributes, roles, identities, and behaviors to specific genders. It's the delineation of cultural and social differences to masculine and feminine, to male, quote unquote, and female. But gender can also be a personal thing, as it can also refer to someone's inner sense of identity. So both instances of gender represent the idea that gender is a social construct, not a biological or fixed category. And gender studies analyzes how gender roles can impact everyone, among other things. Important to note, gender is different from sex, which more so refers to the separation of biological functions into oftentimes male or female categories. Of course, there are a lot of other things, but it is oftentimes based on biology or your reproductive organs. Note that sex is also a social construct, not just a biological one, as many intersex people face oppression from changing ideas of sex. So, what is considered a man, what is considered a woman biologically have also changed as well. And of course, someone's social gender can be defined differently from their socially defined biological sex. Now, of course, there are many more caveats and points to make, but that's the basic foundation for those terms. Gender studies' ideas of gender and sex relate to the idea of social constructionism, which is the theory that many characteristics in social categories, such as gender and sex, but also race, class, and sexuality, amongst other things, are actually constructs created by humans. So these are humanly defined and often made to uphold institutions of power or are informed by those institutions. While many may consider these attributes immovable, a social constructionist would argue that they are actually formed by culture and power. Integral to this current exploration of gender studies is socially lived experience theory. As you'll see, in tandem with institutional analysis, gender studies takes into consideration the actual lived experiences of day-to-day people to form theory. So, learning and storytelling are equally as important as institutional analysis and statistics and theory, and it oftentimes conceives a more thorough and accurate image of reality by that. So, for instance, analyzing the average person's response to poverty will give a better historical representation of the time as opposed to analyzing what a person who's actually in power may experience, if that makes sense. Lastly, I wanted to touch upon intersectionality. Women's genders and sexuality studies don't just analyze women, but also other forms of oppression as well, because intersectionality essentially analyzes how different forms of oppression can actually intersect with each other. For instance, racism, classism, ableism, misogyny, and more. And these institutions all function together and not separately. A key point to intersectionality is analyzing intersectional identities and uplifting their voices. And so, taking into account intersectionality, we will be specifically analyzing how some institutions and cultural factors impact queer women specifically, not just all women, but also all women too. Part 2, Comp Het. So, some of you guys might not actually know what a lesbian is, and I feel like I should clarify. A lesbian is essentially a label for any non man who's attracted to a non man. To understand lesbianism, you have to understand sexuality, which basically refers to how someone expresses themselves sexually, how they manifest their sexual desires, etc., etc. And oftentimes, sexuality, the term, is used in place of sexual orientation, which refers to what gender someone is attracted to in relation to their own gender. So, if that makes no sense, think about how someone who's heterosexual or straight is someone attracted to the opposite or other gender. And so, with that out of the way, do you remember me mentioning the term comp het? I put a pin in it, and it's actually derived from a bigger term often used in gender studies. That bigger term is compulsory heterosexuality, and it was created by Adrian Rich in the 1980s. It refers to how heterosexuality is enforced onto people, oftentimes women, by the patriarchy. It combines aspects of heteronormativity, which is the idea that heterosexuality is the normal, and androcentrism, which is the idea that the society tends to center male perspectives and privileges in society. Adrian Rich's article entitled Compulsory Heterosexuality and Lesbian Existence, published in 1980, is already an intensive look at the concept and is thus the primary source we will be using to analyze. Adrian posits that heterosexuality is a political institution, not just a personal belief that people have. And it argues that there are 8 forms of male power that oppress women and oftentimes push them away from lesbianism and towards heterosexuality. That being, number 1, denying women of their own sexuality. So, not letting them feel pleasure, etc., etc. 2, forcing male sexuality onto women, oftentimes through force or pressure or other factors, like cultural factors as well. Number 3, exploiting their labor. Number 4, exerting physical or legal control over their children. Number 5, confining them physically, so like making sure they have limited access to space and where they can go. Number 6, objectification, so treating them as objects for transaction or social currency. Number 7, stunting women's creativity. And number 8, limiting women's access to society and knowledge. So as you can see, there are many ways that men exert power over women, and heterosexuality is not a natural conclusion that many people come to, but rather something informed and influenced by broader cultural factors and physical brutality. So, lesbian existence represents women's independence and resistance of male tyranny, and the ability to break taboo and reject compulsory heterosexuality. Even more so, she analyzes the existence of lesbian exclusionism in feminism and advocates for asserting lesbian existence and the lesbian continuum. Note, she defines the lesbian continuum as a range, or as, quote, a range through each woman's life and throughout history of woman-identified experience, end quote. Because, as she argues, if heterosexuality is the default, then lesbianism is seen as other, or as a manifestation of anti-male bitterness. And it's a tendency of feminist thinking to erase these histories of lesbianism, which are important to not only uplifting lesbians, but analyzing male power as well. So the next source that I wanted to incorporate is by sociologist Sophie Jerome, entitled Gal Pals and Compulsory Heterosexuality. In it, Jerome analyzes sexuality of queer youth, specifically how they fail to articulate what is actually attraction. So they don't have the words or the identity to exactly place who they're attracted to in their sexuality. And anecdotally, I found this to be true. I had a friend who insisted they were straight, despite her attraction to women. And I remember she would tell me that it doesn't count if they're a celebrity because that's not actually attraction. Obviously, later on, they found out they were lesbian. Sophie Jerome even analyzes how easy it is to neglect a lack of heterosexual desire and pleasure, that oftentimes the pleasure gap between genders makes it easy to say, oh, that's just how women feel, that's just how it normally is, when in reality, they might actually have other pleasures and other attractions. And oftentimes these attractions are also justified as intense friendships rather than relationships that are worth taking seriously. Sophie also analyzes media's roles in enforcing compulsory heterosexuality through willful neglect of lesbian existence. For instance, in movies, it's oftentimes assumed that people aren't lesbians or that they can't be lesbians, that they're just intense friends or gal pals, or forcefully inserting same-sex affection in relationships in media where it's not necessary. She gives examples of, I think, was it Bend It Like Beckham? I actually don't know. But she gives examples of movies where queer relationships were written out and replaced with deep friendship. Sophie is essentially analyzing how compulsory heterosexuality can impact all women and how it's reinforced by the media. She talks about how comp-het neglects women's pleasures and sexual desires, and how androcentrism and heteronormativity can make its way into the media and affect women overall. So the last two sources I wanted to touch on, I wanted to just kind of talk about briefly, both of which feature bisexuality as a subject. Firstly is an article by Robin Ox entitled Bisexuality, Feminism, Men, and Me. In it, she reinforces the idea that lesbianism, queer sexuality, and rejection of compulsory heterosexuality can lead someone directly to feminist thinking. So if that makes no sense, I'm trying to say that someone questioning and interrogating their own sexual attractions and their own sexuality can kind of lead them to the idea that their sexuality doesn't exist in a vacuum and that it can actually be influenced by broader social factors. So, to aid that, she gives personal insight on how she discovered her queerness and how that led to her to question social constructionism, basically, to question that, hey, maybe there are other factors that made me the way I am that aren't just me naturally. And although she did grow up as a feminist already, she kind of started to question and deeply interrogate her own socialization into gender. So she gives the example of how she had body issues as a child, or beauty issues, or as I mentioned, compulsory heterosexuality, and she talks about how all of those are influenced by male power. She also reflects on the shifting viewpoints of her own as she dated partners of differing genders and how that in fact affected her relationship. Sorry, I need to take a little sip of water. Apologies, I searched up the pronunciation and I even practiced, but I can never seem to get it right when I have the microphone. But the second article I wanted to talk about really quickly is by Jennifer Kmielski. I'm sorry, and it is about bisexual and lesbian young women of color. I just wanted to talk about it as she uses an intersectional approach to analyze oppression, and I think it's worth mentioning. Specifically, she kind of connects how women of color can be objectified and how that can combine with the suppression of queer desire to create a unique intersectional experience for women of color who are queer. She's bringing together theories of compulsory heterosexuality and objectification and relating that to the actual experiences of these people. So in conclusion, across all four sources, we've traced the meanings and instances of comp-het thinking as well as how it connects to other aspects of gender studies. Because comp-het thinking doesn't just impact lesbians, it impacts everyone, because deconstructing compulsory heterosexuality also means deconstructing many forms of male power, which are all interconnected, hence intersectionality. It'll broaden the scope of what non-men can experience and expect in their lives. Part 3. Connections. So, connecting it back to Good Luck Babe, you can see that it was not actually created in a vacuum and is in fact informed and reflective of many broader aspects of gender studies. Again, I do love the song and Chappell Rowan, so if you haven't given it a listen, check it out. At least if you like pop music, it's really a good song. I wanted to bring up some more articles about how compulsory heterosexuality can be enforced. First, we can look at media, and to talk about media, I have two articles. In the first article, we'll call it Article A for simplicity's sake. Article A is about lesbian characters and how they're often killed off or treated as expendable compared to their straight counterparts. It's basically saying that lesbians are oftentimes not treated well by writers, and how that can often be like a moralistic thing and a punishment against lesbianism. And obviously, like, if you're a lesbian and you see all of these characters, and the only time you see lesbians are when they're being killed, it can kind of probably psychologically affect you. Article B that I wanted to talk about is actually more so about queer representation overall. So they looked at a study by GLAD, and it's by NBC, released in 2024, September, and it shows that representation of queer people has actually been declining in major studio movies. So again, we talk about the importance of representation and socially lived experiences, is how are these people going to express their own sexuality if they don't see it on a screen, if they don't see it in other people? Many people have also pointed out that queer women and lesbians often don't get the same amount of energy or effort or attention that other people do. Now, the other part I wanted to talk about really quickly, the other connection, is I wanted to talk about policy a little bit, and so I brought this research article by the Pew Research Center, and they essentially created a resource on legalization of queer marriages across the world. So since 2001, I would say around 30 jurisdictions around the world have enacted laws which allowed gay and lesbian couples to marry. And it's really enlightening to see that it's only 30 jurisdictions around the world, and many people still don't have equal access to marriage. It's yet another instance of policy and force pushing people towards comp-het relationships and away from queerness. Now, it's important to not use this as fuel for xenophobia. It is not under these people's control. Don't use this to think that other people or other countries are lesser than or worse, but use it more so as an opportunity to remind yourself that queer people exist outside of America and that there's still work to be done for them as well as for us. Speaking of which, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we can do. And as you can see, I have an abbreviated version on screen, but I wanted to talk a little bit about what you can do. So, first, there are like personal things to sort out. Make sure to ensure that you're always interrogating your biases and never assume that a belief or attribute to be fixed or safe from external influence. Essentially, as social constructionism teaches us, nothing really you identify as or you think exists in a vacuum, and then oftentimes it is influenced by other things. So make sure to always be questioning that. Also, ensure to enlighten yourself by reading works by queer women and other people, and listen to the stories of people telling you that they are hurt. Listen to the stories of the oppressed. I wanted to talk about also using your words to defend queer people. Lastly, I know it can be hard to, speak up for people, fear of harassment or not knowing what to say, but speak out against bigotry of all kinds and spread awareness and kindness and set up a culture that ensures that these marginalized people are safe and that they feel like they can navigate the world properly. The second thing I wanted to touch on is more action based. So, if you live in Merced, the MAC has an LGBTQIA resource center which features things like job opportunities, volunteering opportunities, support groups, educational opportunities. There are actually many more resources near you than you may think outside of Merced and other places. So, do your research. There's always some organization that is, seeking support or is not already formed and could use your help. Lastly, I want to talk about donations, which I know is oftentimes not possible for a lot of people, but you can also donate things other than money, like your effort, your energy, and your time. I found an interesting organization, which I found was I felt had like a degree of credibility. They took into account intersectionality in their bio, and they had a long history. It is the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and they are advocating for things like banning conversion therapy, fighting discrimination, advocacy, even like making sure that people have equal access to resources. I would like to give a thanks to our professor. Thank you, professor, for compiling all of these sources. As you can see, these are the ones. The first four I've pulled from Canvas, so you can access them there. I kind of link them there. And hopefully I link the other sources that I have in the description if you want to look at those there, but here they are. Again, thank you so much for your time. Have a great day. Thank you.